Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Well, today I saw a story in the newspaper about microchipping cats for identification purposes. I'm sure you know that around the world, some pet owners, well, they like to have their cat microchipped so that if there's any problems with the cat or if the cat disappears, it is possible to identify it if someone else finds it so you can know who the real owner is. Because you know what cats are like. They can travel great distances. They can run onto buses, they can run onto trains, or they can even travel in cars. And they can make friends with other families who feed them as well. Well, today in the news, there's a story that in England, all cats now must be microchipped. There's no exceptions. All cats must be microchipped. And I thought, that's a little bit strange because this news story is saying that all cats in England must be, but what about the rest of the UK? Surely there must be similar laws in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Well, I was able to find out a little bit about the Scottish law, but it took me a long time and it was very, very confusing. When you start looking at something that's very, very confusing, you can say it's like a can of worms. You know those little insects, the worm. Yes, well, something which goes in many different directions, like a project or something which you can't control, you can say, oh, I'm sorry I started this. It's like opening a can of worms. And that's exactly how I felt, trying to work out what the law is in the UK about microchipping your pets. Now, you might not know this, but the UK is one country for defences, for immigration, for health. But internally, the UK is made up of 4 nations, and they can be very, very different. Let me give you some examples, but first of all, I want to tell you the situation about microchipping your pets. So, in England, if you don't have your cat microchipped, you will face a penalty of £500. In Scotland, you don't have to have your cat microchipped, so it's your choice. And I've not been able to find anything about Northern Ireland or Wales. Now, this isn't the only difficulty. Part of the problem is communication. Because if you think of, for example, the BBC News, the BBC News report on everything the government is doing, and unless you have a very good ear and are able to listen very well, you won't really know if the new law applies to you, depending on where you are in the UK. This story about the cat microchipping, I noticed it when it made reference to pet owners in England. But I see that other websites, particularly websites about keeping pets, are saying the UK government are or have made a decision about cats and getting them microchipped. Well, that's not really true. I guess the UK government did make a decision, but only for England. Let me explain a little bit more about the 4 nations and their governments, just to give you some background information. So the UK is made up of 4 nations. Each of them have their own parliaments, and they can make their own decisions. Now, you might think that would make it easier, but actually it doesn't. For example, the Scottish government doesn't feel that cats need to be microchipped, probably because in the northern part of the UK it's very agricultural. There's many more wild animals going around than in the south, like London, for example. Then in Northern Ireland and Wales, they make their own decisions based upon what they need. In Scotland, you can marry at age 16. In England, you can't marry at age 16 unless your parents agree. You have to wait until you're 18. In all of the nations, you have to wait until you're age 18 before you're able to drink alcohol. So you can marry at 16 in the north, you can't marry at 16 in the south, and you have to wait until you reach age 18 to drink anyway, which means that if you get married, you can't drink in support of your marriage at your wedding reception, your wedding party. You're not technically able to drink alcohol. So you can see it all becomes a little bit confusing. In Scotland, students don't pay for tuition fees at university or college, but in England, you have to pay for everything. In Scotland, you get free eye tests for everyone, but in England, well, only if you're not working. And the list continues. In healthcare, you get free medicine in Scotland for everyone. In England, only if you're older, 60 plus, or if you're not working. It becomes a little bit complicated, not only with the different laws, but especially in the communications of them. Because most of our news channels, particularly news, aren't really local. You'd have to be living in that area to know all about the benefits you can get from that area. The 4 parliaments around the UK work really well. They're democratically elected, which means that they have their own choices and decisions based upon local needs. And as they evolve and change, it's not always clear where they're going. The Scottish government, for example, now is a government which wants independence, and the people, it seems, have voted for the country to break away from the Union. And the central government is kind of saying, oh, well, we didn't really want you to do that. And so there's all kinds of legal problems. The Northern Ireland government, well, they have a lot of tribal and political issues, and so their parliament keeps starting and stopping. And when that happens, the central government can take control again, but only in certain circumstances. The Welsh government these days, they've also changed their name into something in the Welsh language to make themselves appear to be very different from England. And what about England itself? Well, it doesn't have its own parliament like the other 3 nations. It's simply ruled by the central government. It all works very well, but sometimes there's little bits of friction. Sometimes, because of the way they're all set up, it kind of looks like they're working against each other. But that's not really their idea. The idea is to serve local people. The central government now realizes that, well, it's not really in touch with everyone around the UK. So it wants to move some departments outside of London. It's hoping that in the future, different government departments will be placed, for example, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in different parts of England and Wales. By doing that, it could make the central government more popular. But as the local governments get more and more power, they kind of feel separate from the central government. So by having a central government office in the middle of a locally run parliament, well, many people wouldn't like that. Also, many of these departments, they have very specialized knowledge, which need very specialized people. And well, those people just don't exist in other parts of the UK. Now, young people who are growing up don't really pay so much attention to the central government. They just want to support the local government. So, if an office of the central government appears in a city, local people might say, well, why would I want to work there? I prefer to work for the local government. So you see, there's all kinds of questions which have to be answered to ensure that the government runs smoothly. The four nations do work together, but sometimes nationalism comes out in some of the decisions that they make. The Scottish government, for example, has opened up lots of schools to teach Scottish Gaelic. It's changed all of the train station names into Gaelic, along with an English translation. And when we see them, we think, that's very different. A few days ago, an ambulance, taking someone to the hospital, passed me. And it had really weird spelling of the word ambulance in English. And I thought, that's really strange. But then I remembered that it was written in Gaelic. It's not just here, it's the same in other countries in Europe. If you look at the Basque Country in Spain or Catalonia, where Barcelona is, you can see that increasingly they have their own ways of doing things, and they're becoming more and more separate from the central governments. So, I suppose the central government has to work much harder to try to preserve the union, or maybe one day we'll become like the United States, where four nations have complete powers to do whatever they want, but something is there to hold them together. As we say in English, watch this space. And that simply means, well, we need to wait and see what happens in the future. Even if the UK will survive, because maybe it would become four different places. Personally, my feeling is that in order to save the UK, what they might do is empower every area to have its own kind of independence, not just four nations, because there's big problems with the north of England, the south of England, the north of Scotland, the south of Scotland. There isn't very much wealth being spread evenly. The government, the central government, have introduced a project called Levelling Up, to make sure that everyone across the UK has the same chances and they live the same with the same amount of money. But, well, that hasn't really gone so well either, as we've seen from recent news reports. Well, that's a little introduction into how the governments work. And remember, if you are coming to live in the UK and you do decide to get a little cat, well, the cat will need to be microchipped in England, not microchipped in Scotland. I'm not sure about Northern Ireland or Wales. I haven't been able to find out anything. And as for dogs, well, I believe that that also is very confusing. I first read that for dogs, there's already a law in England. There's something in Scotland, but I'm not sure what it is. So, again, it's all very confusing. So, there's a communications problem because our news networks often come from England and they just think that everything applies to them. So, there we are. That's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed this. See you. Bye.